Welcome to English Spoken Stories. I'm Arya, here to help you get better at English. Today's episode is all about why reading is so important. We'll tell the same story at two different levels, easy and a bit harder. Today's show is for people who are just starting to learn English and those who are getting better. We'll tell the same story twice, once for beginners and once for those in the middle. It's called, Why Reading is So Important. Beginner level. Why do you need to read in English? Generally, my students often ask me this. They think they go to classes, do homework, watch films in English, so why should they read books? Actually, reading is the best way to improve your English. And I will tell you why. First, reading is very important. Now, in 2024, more than 10 in 100 people have gone to university. All jobs require more reading and writing than 100 years ago. This is true for everyone, whether you're an office worker or a mechanic. Second, reading will improve your speaking, writing, vocabulary, and grammar better than any other way. It won't improve your listening directly, but it will improve your vocabulary. When you have a better vocabulary, you can listen more easily and improve your listening that way. In school, you probably read a lot of English materials. Remember those dull textbooks and stories with questions at the end? But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about reading for pleasure. When you read a book just because you like it. That's pleasure reading. You're not doing it because a teacher told you to or because you feel like you should. You're doing it because you really want to. In 1965, some schools in America tried an experiment. These schools were for boys who had done bad things, like stealing. They gave some of the boys free books, exciting ones, like James Bond stories. The teacher said, "You don't have to read these books if you don't want to." But guess what? The boys did read the books. And they read a lot of them. Some boys finished a book every 2 days. After 2 years, the teachers gave all the students a test. The students who got the free books improved in reading and writing. And they enjoyed school more. The students who didn't get the books didn't improve much in reading and writing. Some even got worse. This isn't just true for native speakers. They tried something similar with students in Fiji using 3 methods to teach. First, the usual way with grammar classes and exercises. Second, reading quietly in class. Third, reading aloud together with the teacher. After a year, the 2 reading methods were the most successful. They were much better than the students who did regular English classes. They tried the experiment again in Singapore. There, the students who read silently did really well. They scored the highest in grammar tests. The other students had grammar classes, but they didn't do as well on the tests. In regular classes, we try to memorize grammar and vocabulary. When we read, we learn them naturally. Maybe you're thinking, when I read in English, it's too hard. I have to use the dictionary all the time. It's boring. I can't do it. I understand this. And that's why I wrote this book. I think this book will make you enjoy reading because the stories are easy and fun. The early stories are short and simple. And the later ones are longer and harder. When you finish the book, you might think, wow, I did it. I make daily English audio podcasts on this YouTube channel called English Spoken Stories. The stories are easy to learn. And now you can read them at beginner, pre-intermediate, intermediate, or advanced levels. All the stories are fairy tales. Some are very popular, and some are less well known. Maybe you're thinking, fairy tales? Oh, Fairy tales are for children. I need useful vocabulary, business, and science words. But guess what? The vocabulary in these stories can be very helpful. John checked out words in a few stories. And it turns out 85% of those words are on lists of important words for university studies. James and Roberts tried something similar. They wondered if students read 1,000,000 words of science fiction. Would they learn important science words for university? The answer was yes. So, yes, fairy tales are useful for you too. But I understand if you still don't believe me. When I first learned about all of this, I found it hard to believe too. But I like to try new things. And I love learning languages. So, in 2019, I decided to do an experiment. I had wanted to learn French for a long time, but I didn't learn much in regular classes. I said, I will read 1,000,000 words in French. Afterward, I'll see what my level is. 1,000,000 words is about 20 novels. So it was a lot of work. I started with very easy reading, like our stories. Then I read translations of books I knew in English. For example, I read The Mystery Girl and A Beautiful Wife in English. So I read them in French too. Finally, I started reading new books in French. And I loved them. I also listened to podcasts but always read the transcripts and added the words to my goal. After reading a lot, talking to native speakers, and practicing, I got pretty good. I could understand most of what I read, follow clear speech, and chat with people. I spent more time reading than speaking in that year. I learned a lot more than most students learn in 5 years. I didn't try to memorize grammar or words. I just picked them up and learned them naturally. Maybe you're thinking, I don't believe this. Or maybe you're thinking, wow, I'm going to read for hours every day. But I have to say something very important. You must read books that are easy. And you must read books that are enjoyable. For this, subscribe to our channel. Stephen Krashen, an expert in language teaching, says you should only read things in English that are fun and interesting. Read things that are really easy. Things you wouldn't even read in your native language because they are too simple. So, you can read comics, magazines, detective stories, romance stories, and so on. Don't feel bad about reading translations of books, either, when you read really simple books. If there's a word you don't know, it's easy to figure out its meaning without needing a dictionary. So, what counts as easy? Studies suggest that you should be able to understand at least 98% of the words in a text. 98%? That's a lot, right? Yes, it is. Let me give you an example. Imagine a text where 10% of the words aren't real. That means you only understand 90% of the words. Jerry sprang out of bed and opened the curtains. He hummed to himself as he made breakfast. He brewed coffee and spread butter on his toast. Someone called his phone and he answered it. He was very startled by who was calling. So his cup slipped from his hand and fell on the floor. Is that easy to understand? Could you read a whole book like that? Now, here is the same text with only 2% of the words being unfamiliar. So you should understand 98%. Jerry hopped out of bed and opened the curtains. He sang to himself as he made breakfast. He made coffee and put butter on his toast. Someone called his phone and he answered it. He was very surprised by who was calling. So his cup slipped from his hand and fell on the floor. How was that? You probably didn't understand everything. But it was more fun to read than the first text. Right? That's why reading for pleasure is so great. Maybe you don't understand everything, but you understand enough to follow the story. And you don't need to use a dictionary constantly. So, read for pleasure, because you already know the story well. It will be easier to understand. Happy reading and happy learning. Intermediate level. Many students often ask me, why should I bother reading books when I'm already attending classes, doing homework, and watching English films? Well, to put it simply, they're mistaken. Actually, reading is the best thing you can do to learn English. And I'm here to explain why. Firstly, being able to read well is really crucial. Whether it's in English or your own language. In 2024, only 10 out of 100 people went to university. Nowadays, all kinds of jobs, whether office jobs or working with machines, require you to read and write much more than they did 100 years ago. There are more people competing for jobs now. And those who are good at reading have an advantage. Next, reading is the top way to get better at English in general. Yes, that's correct. Reading helps you with speaking, writing, learning new words, and grammar much better than anything else. It might not directly help with listening, but it gives you the words you need to understand spoken English faster. But it's not just any kind of reading we're talking about. In school, you probably read a lot of boring English texts, textbooks and stories with exercises at the end. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about reading for pleasure. That means reading a book because you enjoy it, not because your teacher told you to, or because it's what you're supposed to do to improve your English. No questions, no book reports, just pure pleasure. You might be thinking, that's too good to be true. Let me show you an example. In 1965, there was a test conducted in places called reform centers in America, where troubled young people were helped. One group of students received free books, fun ones like James Bond that would interest boys their age. But, unlike most reading plans, they didn't have to read the books if they didn't want to. They could throw them away, give them back, or even draw on the pages. And no one would be upset. But the boys did read the books, a lot of them. Some of them read a book every 2 days. At the end of 2 years, they tested the students. Not only did their reading and writing greatly improve, but so did their attitude toward school. The students who didn't participate in the program stayed the same, and some even got worse over the 2 years. This isn't just true for native speakers either. A study of English as a second language, ESL, students in the Fiji Islands looked at 3 methods: traditional English teaching, sustained silent reading, reading in silence for a long time, and a more conventional reading program where teachers read aloud to students. At the end of the first year, students who used the 2 different reading methods showed a 15-month improvement in their English skills, while those taught with the traditional method only improved by 6.5 months. In a similar study conducted in Singapore, students who practiced sustained silent reading performed better in grammar tests than those who only attended grammar classes. This suggests that while grammar exercises help us memorize rules, reading for pleasure helps us absorb them naturally. Language rules. Reading allows us to naturally absorb them. But I know what you're thinking. That's all well and good. But when I pick up a book in English, it's too hard for me. I get bored of looking up words and give up after a few minutes. That's why I wrote this book. It is designed to make you fall in love with reading by providing fun, familiar stories that are easy to understand, The stories are all fairy tales. Some are very popular. And some are less well-known. Again, I know what you're thinking. Fairy tales. But those are for kids. I need useful vocabulary about business, science, and technology. There's no way to make that fun. Guess what? The vocabulary in these stories can actually be very helpful. John checked out the words in a few stories. And it turns out 85% of them are on lists of important words for university studies. James and Roberts tried something similar. They wondered if students reading 1,000,000 words of science fiction would learn important science words for university. And you know what? The answer was yes. So yes, reading fairy tales will help your English in all areas. Even for academic purposes. As an English teacher, I've seen many times that the students who do the best are those who read the most. Whether for university, business, or just for travel, reading is the key factor that predicts success. But I understand if you're still unsure. When I learned about all this, I was too. But I love to experiment. And I have a passion for learning languages. So, in 2019, I decided to do my own experiment. I had wanted to learn French for a long time. But I didn't learn much in regular classes. I said, I will read 1,000,000 words in French. And afterwards, I'll see what my level is. 1,000,000 words is about 20 novels. So it was a lot of work. I started with very easy reading, like our stories. Then, I began reading translations of books that I knew in English. For example, I had read The Mystery Girl and A Beautiful Wife in English. So I read them in French too. Finally, I read new books in French, and I loved them. I also listened to podcasts but always read the transcripts and added the words to my goal. After I achieved my goal, I tested myself by writing and talking to native speakers. I found that I was at a decent intermediate level. I could understand almost everything I read, follow clear speech, and have conversations comfortably, even though I had barely spoken the language since I started learning. I had been learning for about a year. And I had made more progress than most students make in 5 years. I didn't memorize vocabulary and grammar rules, I absorbed them. By this point, you're either thinking, this is all complete nonsense, or you're super excited and ready to start reading for hours a day. But the next thing I'm going to say is extremely important. You must read books that are easy. And you must read books that are fun. If a book is too difficult or too boring, put it down and find another one. Stephen Krashen, an expert in second language acquisition, says you should read only material in the second language that is genuinely fun and interesting, material that is so easy. You would probably feel guilty reading it in your primary language. This is your excuse to read comics, magazines, detective stories, romances, etc. There's no shame in reading translations. Ideally, you want to be reading a book so easy that when you see a word you don't know, you can understand its meaning from context. Research has shown that for this to happen, you need to know at least 98% of the words in a text. 98%. That's high. I know. But let me show you an example. Here's a text where I've replaced 10% of the words with nonsense words. Meaning it's 90% comprehensible. Har flowered out of bed and threw open the curtains. It was a beautiful day. He beamed to himself as he did his daily routine, pouring coffee and buttering Puffer. But then his phone rang. And the person paying was so unexpected that he dropped his Vinky on the floor. Is that easy to understand? Could you read a whole book of that? Now, here's the same text with 98% comprehensibility. Jerry jumped out of bed and threw open the curtains. It was a beautiful day. He sang to himself as he did his daily routine, pouring coffee and buttering toast. But then his phone rang. And the person calling was so unexpected that he dropped his coffee cup on the floor. Did you like that? Even if you didn't understand everything, I'm sure it was much more fun to read than the first text. That's the amazing thing about reading for enjoyment. Even if you don't understand every word, you understand enough to follow the story and keep reading without needing a dictionary. So, read for pleasure, because you already know the story well. It will be easier to understand as you read. Focus on understanding the story. And don't worry if you don't know every word. Just relax and enjoy getting lost in the pages. Believe it or not, we learn better when we have fun. These books are divided into levels based on the Common European Framework of Reference, CEFR, which uses levels like A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2. However, these books cover levels A2 to C1. If you're at level A1, you might need more structured teaching before you start reading these books. If you're at level C2, you can start reading books written for native speakers.